Hesitation. That's the first thing you feel in this world, not from the gods towering over golden cities, but from a mortal thief who knows, deep down, that stealing from gods is a terrible idea and does it anyway. You're dropped into an Egypt that isn't a dusty history book setting but a living, vertical hierarchy. Gods literally stand taller than humans, bleed gold instead of red, and rule from palaces that look like someone fused a temple, a spaceship, and a luxury resort into one blinding monument to ego. The coronation of Horus should be a straightforward celebration of order drums, cheering crowds, opulence everywhere. But there's a crack in the ceremony from the start, because everyone in this place is pretending that power is stable when it absolutely isn't. What makes this version of Egypt so strange and kind of fascinating is how casual it is about the divine. The gods walk through the marketplace, they bicker like family, and humans live under them, the way people today might live under billionaires and politicians, resentful, odd, dependent, and totally at their mercy. Bek and Zaya aren't just background extras in this cosmic soap opera, they're the ones who actually feel the gods' decisions, right down to the afterlife where a new rule says you have to pay in treasure just to get through the gate. So while Horus is preparing to have a crown placed on his head, regular people are already calculating what they'll have to sacrifice just to be allowed a peaceful death. And then Set walks in. He doesn't creep or scheme from the shadows. He arrives like a bad omen wrapped in armor, a living reminder that this world's idea of order is built on fear and spectacle. The coronation turns into a coup almost instantly. Osiris is murdered. Horus is brutally blinded. His eyes, the source of his power and literal perception of the world, ripped away. And Egypt slides into a new reality where every rule is rewritten to serve one god's insecurity. In a few minutes of screen time, the movie redraws its map from glorious kingdom of the gods to occupied state under a tyrant, and that transformation is the key to understanding why this story hits differently than a standard myth adaptation. Here's the thing. Gods of Egypt is often remembered as a CG fever dream, an over-the-top fantasy that went too hard on visual excess and not hard enough on realism. But if you step back from the memes and the reputation, what you're looking at is a world where mythology, economics, and emotion are tightly tangled together, where a broke thief can bargain with a disgraced god, where the price of love is measured in both gold and risk, and where the end of the world isn't just a prophecy, it's a business model. This essay is going to live in that tension, between sincere mythic storytelling and wild blockbuster ambition, between clunky execution and genuinely bold ideas, and between the gods on their golden towers and the mortals trying not to get crushed underneath. We're going to zoom in now on how this story actually sets itself in motion, because once that coronation goes sideways, Gods of Egypt stops being a glossy pageant and turns into a very specific kind of quest, a desperate partnership between someone who lost everything and someone who never really had anything to begin with. In Act 1, the movie lays out three pillars it keeps coming back to: the fragile balance of divine politics, the human cost of those decisions, and the way a single impulsive act can ripple all the way from a palace balcony to the gates of the afterlife. On the divine side, the opening stretch doesn't waste time pretending Egypt is a democracy. Horus is being crowned because he's next in line, not necessarily because he's wise or ready, and you can feel that in how casually he treats his own celebration. He glides through the ceremony like someone convinced the world will always bend toward him, trading smirks with Hathor, basking in the crowd's adoration, never really considering that this is the last moment where he'll be unquestionably on top. That overconfidence is important, because it makes the takeover feel less like a twist and more like a collision between complacency and ambition. Set's entrance rewrites the movie's rules in a few brutal beats. He doesn't just kill Osiris. He transforms the throne room into a war zone, unleashing armored minions and turning a family gathering into an execution. The moment he tears out Horus's eyes is staged as both a physical maiming and a symbolic erasure. This is a god of the sky being stripped of sight, a ruler-to-be suddenly unable to see his people or his own future. From there, Set doesn't rely on subtle manipulation. He announces new laws openly, exiling or subjugating other gods, and making it clear that any stability Egypt enjoyed before was conditional, fragile, and now dead. Meanwhile, the human story plays out in the shadows of all that spectacle. Bek and Zaya watch these events, not as neutral observers, but as people whose survival depends on divine whims. Zaya is awestruck by Horus and clings to the idea that the rightful king will bring justice. Bek is much more skeptical, treating the gods like dangerous landlords rather than saviors. Their early scenes together quietly define the emotional stakes. Zaya believes in a better order that might arrive if the right god takes power, while Bek believes in whatever actually keeps them alive in the moment. That tension between faith and pragmatism is what makes their later choices feel grounded instead of just plot required. The shift into Set's regime drives the first act into darker territory almost immediately. Markets become harsher, labor more punishing, and the new afterlife toll system turns death into another thing that can be bought or denied. Zaya is forced into service under a brutal architect, loyal to Set, stuck literally building the vision of a world she doesn't believe in, while Bek is pushed further into crime as the only way to push back, however slightly, against a system designed to crush people like them. The movie wants you to feel that gap between gods who reshake continents with a gesture and humans who might lose everything because one boss has a bad day. Bek's decision to steal one of Horus's eyes is where Act 1 really locks into its adventure mode. It's not just a cool heist. It's a wildly irresponsible, emotionally driven move, born from a mix of love for Zaya and raw anger at how powerless they are. He breaks into traps that were never meant for human hands, navigates architecture built as much as a flex as a security system, and comes away with a literal piece of a god. The tragedy, of course, is that the immediate plan doesn't go the way he hopes, and the price he and Zaya pay launches the rest of the plot. By the time Act 1 closes, the movie has made its deal clear. This isn't just the story of Horus reclaiming a throne, it's the story of a fallen god and a grieving thief using each other to challenge a world that insists only the powerful get to decide what's fair. Once Bek and Horus are forced onto the same path, the movie settles into its full quest mode, a disgraced god who can't fix the world on his own, and a human who refuses to believe the gods ever really cared about it in the first place. Their journey across this version of Egypt isn't just a tour of cool locations, it's a series of stress tests for their alliance, where every new obstacle asks the same question in a different way. Is this partnership actually built on trust, or just mutual desperation? Early on, Horus treats Bek more like a useful tool than a partner. He talks in terms of bargains and conditions, promising to use his restored power to help Zaya only after Bek helps him regain his full strength. Bek, on the other hand, never forgets that he's walking next to someone who used to rule over people like him without really seeing them. That imbalance comes out in small moments. Horus dismissing Bek's fear during a dangerous climb, Bek snapping back with a reminder that, unlike gods, he doesn't have a second life to burn. The movie uses those beats to turn what could have been a simple chosen hero helps fallen king, set up into something more prickly and grounded. Their path forces them into encounters that keep escalating both the stakes and the scale. Crossing the desert isn't just a location shift, it becomes a reminder that this world is layered with rules and creatures designed to keep mortals in their place. When they run into monstrous guardians or elaborate traps, it's not random spectacle. It's architecture built by gods who never expected a human to be standing there in the first place. Every time Bek survives something he was never meant to face, the film quietly chips away at the idea that divinity automatically means superiority. Hathor's involvement complicates things even further. She isn't just a love interest plugged into the plot. She represents a god who's learned to navigate Set's regime through compromise rather than open resistance. Her relationship with Horus is tangled. There's history, guilt, and a shared understanding that they both survived the coup in different ways. When she joins their journey, the dynamic shifts from a simple duo to a triangle, where loyalty, fear, and affection are constantly in play. You can feel that in how she talks to Horus. She sees through his bravado, calls out his pride, and still chooses to help, even knowing the cost could be catastrophic. As the quest pushes them toward more mythic spaces, toward Ra's domain, toward the edges of the flat earth, and the cosmic machinery holding it all together, the movie leans hard into its big, almost comic book vision of mythology. Meeting Ra doesn't feel like a quiet spiritual encounter. It feels like walking into the engine room of the universe and finding out the mechanic is tired, cynical, and still chained to his job. That visit reframes everything, Horus realizes. Set isn't just trying to grab a throne, he's trying to rewrite the entire cosmic order, and Bek gets a first-hand look at how little his individual pain matters to beings who think in terms of planets and ages instead of single human lives. By the midpoint, the road has carved all the illusions away. Bek has seen that gods can be vulnerable, petty, and scared, and Horus has been forced to admit that his claim to leadership is meaningless if it doesn't include the people who die under his decisions. Their alliance is still messy, but it's no longer just a transaction. The quest has become something bigger than revenge or a single resurrection attempt. It's about deciding whether this world is going to keep running on fear and gold, or whether someone is finally going to fight for a different kind of balance. The thing about final acts in myth-based blockbusters is that they usually go one of two ways. Either the scale keeps growing until it means something, or the scale keeps growing until it drowns everything else. Gods of Egypt sprints toward both outcomes simultaneously, and the race between them is exactly what makes the third act worth pulling apart. Set's master plan crystallizes into something genuinely darker than a simple power grab. It turns out the pyramid he's been building, the one Zaya was forced to help construct, isn't a monument to his ego, it's a weapon. He intends to feed the accumulated treasure, and essentially the souls, of the dead into a mechanism designed to destroy the barrier between Egypt and the void. The crawling darkness where Apophis, the chaos serpent, endlessly circles the edge of Ra's solar ship. Set doesn't just want to rule Egypt, he wants to tear a hole in the architecture of existence itself. It's a plan born from genuine anguish, a god who was overlooked, passed over, and quietly resented his entire divine life, deciding that if he can't have the world on his terms, nobody gets a world at all. That motivation lands harder than it probably should because the movie takes just enough time in the build-up to let you see the wound underneath the armor. Meanwhile, Bek is running out of time in the most personal way possible. The bargain he struck, his dangerous, love-fueled promise to help Horus in exchange for Zaya's resurrection, is sitting on a ticking clock because every moment they spend chasing Set is another moment Zaya remains dead. The movie doesn't let you forget this. Bek is surrounded by gods who can casually reshape reality, and he can't do the single thing that matters most to him. That powerlessness keeps grinding against his growing competence. He's proved himself smarter, braver, and more adaptable than anyone expected, yet the one outcome he wants most is still out of reach. It's a quietly brutal setup, and the film deserves credit for not resolving it cheaply. Horus's transformation across the final act is where the character work from the earlier segments either pays off or falls flat, depending on your patience with the arc. He started as someone whose power was so tied to entitlement that losing his eyes felt almost cosmically appropriate. You can't rule people you never really looked at. By the time he's facing Set for the last time, the journey has physically and emotionally stripped away the version of Horus who treated Bek like a useful instrument. The fight between them isn't just two gods swapping blows in a CG arena. It's a debate about what power is actually for. Set argues that strength without limits is the only honest truth. Horus, having spent weeks depending on a mortal to survive, has learned something Set never did. Real strength includes the ability to care about someone weaker than you without treating it as a weakness. The climactic battle sequence pulls out every visual stop the film has been holding in reserve. Gods transform into armored, monstrous forms. Horus into something like a great falcon warrior, Set into a creature that looks like war itself took a physical shape. The scale pushes into pure blockbuster territory, all chaos and motion and sheer kinetic noise. And here's the thing, on a pure spectacle level, it delivers. The film has been building toward this kind of release, and the choreography and creature design genuinely communicate the difference between a god fighting to protect and a god fighting to annihilate. But the movie is also smart enough to not let the battle carry all the emotional weight by itself. Bek's moment near the climax is where Gods of Egypt makes its most sincere play for genuine feeling. When he chooses to act without any guarantee of surviving, without any divine protection, without even the certainty that his sacrifice will matter, that's the movie asking you to measure one ordinary human life against the whole spectacle surrounding it. It's a small moment in terms of screen time, but it lands, because the film has spent its entire runtime building the argument that human lives are exactly what all this mythic noise is supposed to be protecting. Everything else, the stolen eyes, the afterlife gold, the cosmic weapons, all of it is just context for that one choice made by one person who doesn't have armor or powers or a prophecy backing him up. Ra's role in the resolution brings the cosmic perspective back in, but not in a way that undermines the human stakes. Ra has been portrayed throughout as an ancient, exhausted god who keeps the darkness at bay mostly out of habit and duty, not heroism. His involvement in stopping Set's plan doesn't come with a triumphant speech or a god-powered cavalry charge. It arrives the way real turning points often do in this kind of story, with an old power acknowledging that the new generation has to take responsibility for what comes next. He gives Horus back something important, not as a reward but as a recognition that the game has changed. The resolution of the afterlife system is where the movie puts its ideological stakes on the table and asks you to take them seriously. Set's pay-to-enter policy wasn't just a villain's quirk, it was a worldview that treated death as another arena where the wealthy could extend their power and the poor got punished for being poor. When Horus dismantles that system, the film isn't just tidying up a plot thread, it's completing the argument that began the moment Set walked into that coronation. That authority which extracts from the vulnerable instead of protecting them isn't order. It's just well-decorated cruelty. Bek's entire journey orbited that argument without ever naming it, and the fact that the resolution addresses it directly rather than just restoring the old status quo is a meaningful choice. Does the third act stumble? Absolutely. Some of the CGI compositing phrase under the weight of the ambition, a few emotional beats feel rushed because the film is trying to resolve both a god war and a love story in the same 10-minute stretch. The transition from cosmic threat back to intimate human moment is handled with varying degrees of grace. And if you came in hoping for a tightly constructed mythological epic with every thread sewn shut, you'll leave with some loose ends in your hands. But if you came in willing to watch a movie that's genuinely trying to say something about power, grief, and what separates a ruler from a tyrant wrapped inside a gloriously excessive fantasy action framework, the final act rewards that investment. The scale that earlier threatened to swallow everything ends up serving the story more than drowning it. And that's a harder trick to pull off than it looks. Let's talk about the people actually carrying this movie, because without them, Gods of Egypt would just be a very expensive screensaver. The thing that separates a memorable blockbuster from a forgettable one almost always comes down to character. Not world building, not VFX budgets, not mythological accuracy. Character. And Gods of Egypt has a genuinely interesting set of them, even if the film doesn't always give them the breathing room they deserve. Horus, Bek, and Set form a triangle of competing philosophies about power, loss, and identity that the movie keeps returning to like a tuning fork. Around them, Hathor, Zaya, and Thoth fill in the emotional and tonal edges in ways that are smarter than their screen time suggests. Horus, the god who had to learn to look down. Nikolaj Coster-Waldau plays Horus with a specific kind of charm that's easy to underestimate, the charm of someone who knows they're likable and uses it as armor. When we first meet him, he is all golden confidence and easy smiles, moving through the world like someone who has never seriously entertained the idea that things might not go his way. The filmmakers could have played this as just arrogant hero who learns humility, and on a surface reading, that's exactly what happened. But Coster-Waldau does something a little more specific with. Watch how Horus talks to people early on. He makes eye contact, he's warm, he's almost playful, but there's no weight behind it. He's performing likability without actually investing in the people in front of him. That's a crucial distinction the performance makes without spelling it out. Horus isn't cruel to his subjects, he's just genuinely not thinking about them, their scenery, background characters, and the story of his coronation. And that casual, unconscious dismissal is far more damning than any mustache-twirling villainy would be, because it's recognizable. It's the behavior of someone who grew up being told the world existed for them and never had reason to question. Losing his eyes is the film's central metaphor, and it's not even subtle about it. But the lack of subtlety is appropriate here. This is myth, after all, and myths use big gestures to talk about interior truths. A god of the sky who cannot see is a ruler who is finally forced to experience vulnerability. Every moment after that, blinding is Horus, calibrating what it means to navigate a world that stopped accommodating him. And the fascinating thing is how badly he handles it at first. He doesn't become humble in a clean movie montage way. He bargains, he snaps at Bek, he retreats into bravado when he feels exposed. That messiness, that persistent pride even inside defeat, is what makes his eventual growth feel earned rather than automatic. The partnership with Bek is where the transformation actually happens, and it happens in increments small enough to feel real. There's a moment somewhere in their journey where Horus stops issuing commands and starts asking Bek what he thinks, and it's played so quietly you might miss it if you're not watching. That's Coster-Waldau's best work in the film, making a seismic internal shift visible through a slight softening of posture, a genuine laugh that doesn't have any performance behind it, a willingness to be wrong in front of someone he technically outranks by cosmic decree. By the time Horus enters his final confrontation with Set, the version of him that walks into that battle is someone who has learned what it costs to protect people rather than just rule them. That's a complete arc. It's not a revolutionary one, but it's executed with enough specificity to stick. Bek, the mortal, who refused to act like one. Brenton Thwaites gets the harder job in this movie. Playing the ordinary human in a film full of towering gods and world-ending schemes requires a very specific kind of energy. Too much wide-eyed wonder, and the character becomes a tourist. Too much quippy sarcasm, and he becomes a distraction. Thwaites threads that needle more deftly than he gets credit for, because Bek never acts like a man impressed by the supernatural. He acts like a man exhausted by it. That exhaustion is the key to the character. Bek doesn't disbelieve in the gods. He can't. They're standing right in front of him, and occasionally dropping things on him. What he disbelieves in is the idea that the god's existence is automatically good for people like him. That's a genuinely sharp starting point for a protagonist. He enters the story not as a wide-eyed dreamer looking for adventure, but as someone who has already done the math on how this divine system works and concluded, correctly, that it's rigged. His love for Zaya is the only reason he's willing to roll the dice against those odds. What makes Bek's emotional arc hit is how closely tied it is to grief rather than triumph. Other action heroes in this kind of movie grow more powerful as the story progresses. Bek grows more heartbroken. He's sharper, braver, more capable by the film's climax, but those qualities are in service of a loss he can't outrun. Every clever trick, every narrow escape, every moment he keeps up with gods who shouldn't even register his existence, all of it circles back to the fact that the person he's doing it for is already gone, and he's gambling on a promise from a divine being who, until recently, wouldn't have remembered his name 5 minutes after a conversation. The dynamic between Bek and Horus only works because Thwaites plays it with a particular kind of stubborn dignity. He's not impressed by Horus, he's not grateful to be in a god's presence, he needs Horus and he knows it and he resents it a little, and he shows all three of those things at once without it ever tipping into hostility. That's a nuanced read on what could have been a simple sidekick role. The chemistry between Thwaites and Coster-Waldau feels genuinely collaborative, like two actors who both decided their characters should push back on each other rather than just play to the script's preferred hierarchy. And then there's Bek's final sacrifice, the moment when everything he's worked toward is balanced against one enormous risk with no guaranteed outcome. It's a quiet beat inside a loud movie, and Thwaites plays it without any of the swelling self-importance that usually accompanies a hero's pivotal choice. He's scared, he does it anyway. Not because destiny said so, not because a prophecy pointed at him, but because the math of love is sometimes simpler than the math of survival, and he's always been better at that calculation than any of the gods surrounding him. Set, the villain who makes a terrible kind of sense. Gerard Butler's Set is the most interesting character in the movie, and it's not particularly close. That's not a criticism of Horus or Bek, it's just the nature of the story. The villain's motivation is the narrative's load-bearing wall, and Butler builds something genuinely surprising on that foundation, a god whose cruelty is inseparable from his pain. Set is not a random force of chaos. He's a specific kind of antagonist, the one who had a legitimate grievance, turned it into a worldview, and then weaponized that worldview until it consumed everything, including whatever was originally human and understandable about his anger. He was passed over. He watched a brother receive adoration while he was given responsibility without recognition, power without affection, authority without belonging. In mythological terms, that's a story as old as Cain and Abel, and the film knows it. Set isn't wrong that the divine hierarchy was built on favoritism. He's catastrophically wrong about what to do with that knowledge. Butler plays him with a kind of volcanic restraint in the film's early scenes that makes his later eruptions land harder. When Set takes the throne, when he announces his new laws, when he looks at Egypt and decides to remake it in the image of his resentment, Butler doesn't play those moments as pure triumph. There's something almost sad underneath the power, a hollowness that the armor and the speeches and the god-scale violence can't quite fill. The scene where he explains his relationship with Ra is particularly revealing. This is a god who wanted a father's love and settled for a father's fear, and somewhere along the way convinced himself those things were the same. His plan to destroy the boundary between Egypt and the void is the logical endpoint of that psychology. If he can't have the world he wanted, he'll unmake the world he got. It's the most extreme expression of a very recognizable human failing, the inability to imagine that the world could be good for you if you had to share it. Set doesn't want justice, he never really did. He wants acknowledgement, and he's been denied it long enough that acknowledgement has curdled into a desire for destruction. Butler makes that progression feel lived in rather than scripted, and it elevates what could have been a generic conqueror into someone whose final moments carry genuine weight. Hathor, more than she appears. Elodie Yung has some of the most precise work in the film, delivered in a role that the script underserves. Hathor, goddess of love, could easily be furniture. The love interest who exists to motivate Horus, softened into passivity by divine glamour. Young refuses that interpretation at every turn. The key to Hathor is her survival strategy under Set's regime. She's wearing a bracelet that keeps the souls of the dead in check, a bracelet that, if removed, would unleash chaos that destroys her. She negotiated some version of a deal with Set, not because she agreed with him, but because she understood that martyrdom wasn't the same as resistance. That pragmatism sits interestingly against Horus's romantic notions of righteous battle. She's been doing what Bek has been doing, surviving inside a system designed to crush her, making compromises she hates, waiting for something to change. The difference is, she's doing it from inside gilded captivity rather than a marketplace. Her scenes with Horus carry real emotional history. There's no exposition dump explaining their past. Young and Coster-Waldau play it in glances and pointed silences that suggest years of complicated feeling. She doesn't perform lovesick devotion. She performs something more ambivalent, the feeling of caring deeply about someone you've also watched make enormous mistakes and aren't sure has learned from them. Thoth, unexpected comedy and genuine wisdom. Chadwick Boseman's Thoth is the film's tonal wildcard, and he plays it beautifully. God of wisdom, collector of minds, comfortable with his own genius in a way that tips just barely into absurdity. Thoth arrives in the film's midpoint and immediately shifts the register. Boseman brings a dry, almost professorial humor to the role that bounces entertainingly off Bek's exhausted sarcasm and Horus's deflated pride. But Thoth isn't just comic relief. His accumulated knowledge functions as the film's wisdom tradition. He's the character who understands the cosmic stakes with the most clarity and chooses to act on that understanding even when the odds are ridiculous. There's something quietly moving about a god defined by intellect deciding that knowledge without action is just elaborate inaction. Boseman finds real warmth underneath the wit, and every scene he's in moves faster and smarter for his presence. Zaya, the moral compass the movie can't afford to lose Courtney Eaton. Zaya is on screen for a fraction of the film's runtime, but her absence drives the plot more forcefully than most characters who are present. She functions as the moral center that the story keeps orienting toward. Her faith in Horus, her love for Bek, her willingness to risk everything for an idea bigger than her own safety. She believes in the old order, not out of naivete, but out of a considered conviction that things could be better, and that conviction matters enough to die for. Her death in the early acts isn't handled as shock value. It's handled as a cost, the specific, irreversible price that Bek pays for loving someone who believed in the possibility of a better world inside a system designed to punish that kind of belief. And the film keeps that cost visible throughout its runtime, refusing to let Bek's grief become purely functional to the plot. Every moment he bargains with gods over her fate, you remember that this isn't an abstract negotiation. It's a man trying to hold on to a specific person, specific laugh, specific way she looked at him like he was worth more than the world told him he was. What's striking about the full character ensemble of Gods of Egypt is how much of the film's real argument runs through them rather than around them. The mythology is the setting, the gods versus gods conflict is the framework. But the actual question the movie is asking, what is power for and who does it serve, only gets answered in the choices these specific people make under pressure. That's good storytelling instinct, even when the execution stumbles. The characters aren't decoration for the spectacle, they're the reason the spectacle is supposed to matter. Alex Proyas built worlds before Gods of Egypt, Dark City, The Crow, Even I, Robot, a film that used its future cityscape as a character in its own right. So when he signed on to a fantasy epic about living gods and mythological warfare, he wasn't approaching it as a director who needed to figure out how to make the impossible look real. He was approaching it as someone who'd spent his career asking a more interesting question: how do you make the impossible feel inevitable? Whether he fully succeeds in Gods of Egypt is debatable. That it's one of the most visually ambitious studio fantasies of the 2010s is not. The world design, a mythology built from scratch. The first and most fundamental technical decision the film makes is rejecting archaeological realism entirely. This isn't the Egypt of the Ten Commandments, all sandstone and historical plausibility. It isn't even the stylized but grounded Egypt of earlier sword and sandal epic. The Egypt of Gods of Egypt is a place that never existed anywhere except in the collective imagination of someone who read mythological texts and then asked what would happen if you threw all physical limitations out the window. The scale is the most immediate expression of that choice. Gods stand roughly 9 feet tall in this world, towering above humans in a way that's meant to feel both wondrous and slightly oppressive. Production designer Owen Paterson, who built the Matrix's monochrome digital corridors and Zion's rusted industrial chambers, applied the same logic here. The world should communicate its power structures before a single line of dialogue explains them. When Horus stands in a marketplace, you understand the hierarchy instantly, not from narration, not from costume alone, but from sheer physical differential. Power made geometric. The palace architecture extends that idea in almost every shot. Proyas and Patterson built the divine spaces as something between a temple and a mechanism, all towering columns, reflective gold surfaces, and chambers that look less like rooms where people live and more like rooms where decisions about reality are processed. There's something vaguely industrial about it, which sounds wrong for ancient Egypt, but actually works beautifully in context. These gods don't just receive worship, they administer it. The architecture communicates that. Set's fortress takes the aesthetic even further into dark territory. Where Horus's world is gold and open sky, Set's domain is obsidian and shadow, built at an angle that suggests instability, as if the whole structure is leaning into violence. The pyramid under construction carries a similar visual language. It's enormous, it's overwhelming, and it's unmistakably a weapon dressed as a monument. Patterson's design choices make you feel Set's ideology before the script articulates it. The VFX philosophy, sincere excess. Let's be direct about this. The VFX in Gods of Egypt are aggressively, unapologetically artificial. The green screen compositions are visible in ways they aren't in, say, Mad Max, Fury Road, or the MCU films of the same era. Actors are frequently placed against digital environments that glow with an intensity that CG hasn't quite mastered. Too bright, too clean, with the kind of hyper-real sheen that signals, this is a constructed world, more loudly than the filmmakers probably intended. Here's the thing, though, that hyper-reality isn't entirely accidental, and penalizing the film for it misses something important about what Proyas was attempting. He has explicitly talked about the influence of Egyptian art itself on the visual approach, the flat planes, the bold colors, the disproportionate scale used in ancient paintings and reliefs to communicate divine hierarchy rather than physical accuracy. In ancient Egyptian art, a pharaoh is always larger than his subjects, not because he was literally taller, but because his importance demanded more visual space. Gods of Egypt is trying to do something analogous, construct a cinematic world that follows mythological logic rather than physical logic. Does it always work? No. There are sequences, particularly involving fast-moving creature battles, where the compositing falls apart under speed and motion blur, and the CGI creatures lose visual weight and start floating against their backgrounds. The Cobra fight and certain aerial battle sequences are the worst offenders. But in the film's slower, more considered moments, the long establishing shots of the divine city, the interior spaces where gods hold court, the transition sequences as the world's flatness is revealed at its edges, the aesthetic earns its ambition. When Horus, Set, or Thoth shift from human form to armored warrior animal form, the effect is handled as a full-body physical event rather than a simple morphing trick. Bones restructure. Metal seems to grow from skin. The transformations are violent-looking in a way that suggests the divine form costs something, even for gods. That design decision communicates character. These aren't effortless powers. They're expressions of divine will under pressure. When Set transforms in the climax, the weight and scale of it make the battle feel genuinely dangerous in a way that a smoother, more elegant transformation wouldn't. Cinematography. Light is hierarchy. Cinematographer Peter Menzies Jr. worked with specific light temperatures to reinforce the film's divine hierarchy in ways that most viewers absorb without consciously registering. Scenes in the divine world are flooded with warm gold, an almost overwhelming saturation that makes the spaces feel expensive and slightly nauseating at the same time, the visual equivalent of too much cologne. It's intentional. This is power that performs itself, and the cinematography is in on the performance. Human spaces are shot cooler and flatter. Bek and Zaya's scenes in markets and streets have a less saturated palette that makes them feel immediate and fragile against all that golden grandeur. Menzies uses depth of field to separate the two worlds as well. Divine spaces tend toward shallow focus that isolates figures against blurred golden excess, while human scenes use deeper focus that grounds characters in their environments. You're never confused about which world you're in, even during transitions, because the light tells you before the set design does. The film's most visually striking sequence, Ra's solar ship traveling above the flat Earth, with the void circling below, uses this logic at maximum scale. The contrast between the burning warmth of Ra's solar fire and the absolute darkness of Apophyse's domain below reads as more than spectacle. It's the film's central visual thesis, light and darkness, order and chaos, maintained in perpetual, exhausting balance by a single tired god who keeps rowing because the alternative is annihilation. Menzies lights that sequence to feel both magnificent and terrifying, and it's the moment where Gods of Egypt's visual ambition most fully justifies itself. Direction, Proyas's control of scale and intimacy. Alex Proyas's directorial strength has always been in contrast, placing intimate character moments inside enormous, alienating environments and finding the emotional texture in that dissonance. Gods of Egypt is full of that instinct. The scene where Horus first meets Thoth is staged inside a space of almost absurd grandeur, multiple versions of Thoth milling around shelves of accumulated knowledge stretching to invisible ceilings, and yet Proyas keeps the camera tight enough on faces to make it feel like a conversation between equals who haven't decided if they trust each other yet. The world is enormous. The people in it are small. That's the film's entire argument delivered through composition. His handling of action sequences is more variable. The large-scale battles benefit from his willingness to let the geography be clear. Proyas doesn't cut during disorientation. He holds shots long enough for you to understand spatial relationships before the chaos hits. That's a genuine skill, increasingly rare in contemporary blockbusters where rapid cutting is used to disguise unclear choreography. When a divine battle breaks out, you generally know who's where, which is more than can be said for a lot of films 10 times the budget. Where Proyas occasionally loses control is in pacing the emotional beats against the spectacle beats. The film sometimes transitions from a quiet, intimate character moment directly into full-scale action without adequate runway, and the tonal whiplash can be jarring. That's partly a script issue and partly a directorial choice. He seems more comfortable in the extremes than in the gradations between them. The scenes that require slow accumulation of feeling occasionally feel rushed, as if the film is anxious about its own quiet moments. But in the sequences where he's given full permission to go enormous, the coronation, the final battle, the cosmic machinery of Ra's realm, Proyas demonstrates a confidence with pure visual storytelling that very few directors bring to mid-budget fantasy spectacle. He's not making this world feel real. He's making it feel mythic, and those are fundamentally different ambitions requiring fundamentally different technique. Production design. World is argument. Owen Paterson's production design holds the film together in ways that go beyond aesthetic. Every environment in Gods of Egypt is designed to communicate the value system of whoever built it. Osiris's court is open, lit from multiple directions, arranged to accommodate crowds, architecturally democratic in the mythological sense. Set spaces are narrow, hierarchical, lit from single dramatic sources that create heavy shadow, designed for dominance rather than governance. The Afterlife Gate, the enormous structure where Anubis weighs hearts and souls queue for judgment, is the film's most evocative design achievement. It looks like a courthouse, and a cathedral had a child that was raised in the desert, all severe angles and impossible scale, with a line of the dead stretching to the horizon like an immigration queue at the end of time. That image, divine bureaucracy made stone, says something sharp about the film's themes without saying a word, and it arrives early enough to set the ideological stakes before the plot has articulated them directly. The costumes, designed by Liz Keogh, work in concert with the production design to extend the visual hierarchy. Gods wear materials that seem too heavy, too layered, too elaborate for the physical world. Armor that looks like it was designed for combat in a world governed by different physical laws. Human characters wear clothes that look worn, practical, and improvised. That contrast is consistent throughout. The divine world is about projection. The human world is about survival. The score, Marco Beltrami's mythological machinery. Marco Beltrami's score for Gods of Egypt doesn't get discussed much, which is a shame because it's doing significant structural work throughout the film. Beltrami builds his themes around a tension between ancient-sounding instrumental texture, sustained strings, resonant percussion, melodic lines that suggest antiquity without being pastiche, and more modern, driving rhythms that push the action sequences into kinetic urgency. The theme associated with Horus starts wide and majestic and gradually becomes more grounded over the course of the film, shifting from orchestral sweep to something more personal. That's not accidental. The score is tracking the same arc the character is on, moving from divine grandeur toward human weight. Set's theme is built on unstable intervals that never quite resolve, harmonically restless, like a chord that keeps promising to land on solid ground and keeps pulling away at the last moment. It's a sophisticated musical characterization that most people absorb as texture while watching, but which is quietly reinforcing everything the script and performances are doing. The sequence where Bek navigates the trapped vault to steal Horus's eye is scored with a tightly wound combination of percussion and strings that communicates both the physical danger and the emotional stakes without tipping into comedy or melodrama. It's a hard needle to thread, and Beltrami lands it. Technical craft in Gods of Egypt is a case study in ambitious intention meeting variable execution. The world design is genuinely distinctive. The cinematography is consistent and purposeful. The direction at its best demonstrates a filmmaker with a clear visual philosophy applied to an enormous canvas. And the places where the technology strains, where the CG phrase or the compositing goes artificial, are mostly visible because the ambition surrounding those moments is so high. You notice the seams in Gods of Egypt in a way you don't always notice them in safer films because safer films never stretch their canvas quite this far. That's worth something. Not as an excuse for technical shortcomings, but as context for what the shortcomings cost. A film that reaches too far and misses in spots is doing something fundamentally different from a film that never reaches at all. Here's a question worth sitting with. What does a movie about Egyptian gods fighting over a throne actually have to say? Because the easy answer, it's about good versus evil, order versus chaos, is technically accurate and almost completely useless. Every fantasy film is about good versus evil. Every myth ever told involves order and chaos colliding somewhere. What's interesting about Gods of Egypt isn't that it engages those ideas. It's how it engages them, and through which specific human anxieties it chooses to filter its mythology. Pull back the gold and the creature battles, and what you find is a film making three sustained, interlocking arguments about what separates legitimate authority from mere power, about the way economic systems turn even sacred things into commodities, and about whether love is a weakness or the only honest measure of anything. None of those are small ideas. The film doesn't always handle them with the delicacy they deserve, but it handles them with consistent sincerity, and in a genre that too often substitutes spectacle for substance, that sincerity earns respect, power, and the question of worthiness. Horus is being crowned not because he's proven anything, but because lineage says he's next. Set takes the throne not through legitimate succession, but through force. The film immediately establishes a world where rightful ruler and actual ruler are two completely different things, and then spends the next 2 hours asking which one matters more. What's sharp about this framing is that the film refuses to let Horus off the hook simply by virtue of being the good option. He starts as someone whose claim to rule is exactly as arbitrary as Set's in one crucial sense. Neither of them has actually demonstrated, in practice, that they know how to govern people rather than just tower over them. Horus's legitimacy is genealogical. Set's is violent. The movie's argument is that both versions of authority are incomplete, that the only kind of power worth having is the kind earned through accountability to the people subject to it. That's a genuinely sophisticated political idea, and the film buries it inside a buddy quest structure so it doesn't feel like a lecture, but watch how consistently it surfaces. Every time Horus makes a decision that prioritizes his pride over Bek's safety, the film frames it as a governance failure, not just a character flaw. Every time Set issues a decree that treats human lives as units of production rather than people, the camera finds a human face reacting to it. The story is constantly measuring its divine characters against the standard of how their choices land on the smallest, most vulnerable people in their world. Horus passes that test, eventually, because he learns to ask himself that question. Set fails it, catastrophically, because he never asks it once. For him, power is validated by being held, not by what it does for anyone else. That distinction is the film's thesis, and it's delivered not through monologue but through contrast. Two gods, two philosophies, one world that can only accommodate one answer. If you're poor, you get nothing. Not punishment, not a bad afterlife, just nothing. Exclusion from the cosmic order because your bank account didn't clear the entrance fee. This is the film's sharpest satirical edge, and it's easy to miss because it's presented as world building rather than commentary. But sit with the implications for a moment. This is a society where divine authority has extended itself all the way into the eschatological, where the question of whether your soul finds peace after death has been converted into a revenue stream. It's not even presented as especially monstrous within the film's world. It's policy. Set announces it, people grumble, and then they start calculating what they can afford to bring to the gate. The horror is in the normalization. That's a specifically modern anxiety wearing ancient costume. In an era of privatized healthcare, gated communities, and mounting student debt, there's something disturbingly legible about the idea that even the afterlife isn't safe from the logic of the market. You might laugh at the concept the first time the film presents it. The second time you encounter it, when Bek is doing mental math about what he owns, what he could sell, what Zaya would need, it stops being funny. What the film argues, through the resolution of this system, is that the monetization of sacred things is itself a form of violence. It's not just unfair, it's a category error. There are things that should be outside the logic of transaction: dignity, peace, love, the possibility of a just fate after death. And a system that refuses to honor that boundary isn't just economically unjust, it's existentially corrupt. When Horus dismantles the toll in the film's final moments, it's not treated as a minor administrative change. It's treated as a restoration of a basic moral order, which is exactly what it is. Love as the only honest measure against all the divine politics and cosmic machinery. Gods of Egypt keeps insisting on a very simple counter-argument. Love might be the only real thing in any of this. That sounds like a greeting card, but the film earns it by refusing to make love clean or easy or safe. Bek's love for Zaya doesn't save her. It doesn't guarantee anything. It puts him in ridiculous danger, forces him into bargains he can't control, and ultimately asks him to make a choice with no guaranteed outcome. The film is deeply aware that love as a motivational force is irrational, and it treats that irrationality not as a weakness, but as the specific thing that distinguishes human meaning, making from divine power management. Horus and Hathor's relationship is the divine mirror of Bek and Zaya's, and it's deliberately messier. There's history, compromise, guilt, and a kind of love that survived a coup and years of separate captivity without resolving into anything clean. Hathor's feelings for Horus don't make him a better ruler automatically. His feelings for her don't override his pride efficiently. What they do is keep pulling both of them back toward the possibility of something beyond self-interest, even when pure self-interest would be the rational choice. That pull, the way love keeps complicating the math, is the film's answer to Set, whose tragedy is precisely that his wounds made him unable to love anything, including his own ambitions, without weaponizing them. The thematic payoff is in the comparison between Set's motivation and Bek's. Set wants acknowledgement from a father figure who never gave it. Bek wants one specific woman back from the dead. On a cosmic scale, Set's desire should matter more. It's entangled with divine hierarchy, ancient history, the legitimacy of the entire universe's power structure. But the film keeps arguing, through every choice it makes, that Bek's desire is more real, because it's about a person, not a position. Love directed at an actual human being, with all their specific weight and irreplaceability, is different in kind from love directed at an idea of yourself. Set is in love with what he deserves. Bek is in love with who Zaya is. That difference determines everything, mortality as clarity. There's a specific function mortals serve in deity-centric mythology that gods of Egypt handles with more nuance than its reputation suggests. The mortal character isn't there just to give the audience a proxy. They're there because mortality is the only thing that makes choices genuinely cost something. Gods in this film can survive enormous damage. They regenerate, they transform, they operate on timescales that make individual moments feel trivial. Set loses his eye and remains terrifying. Horus is blinded and still has centuries ahead of him. Even Ra, exhausted and ancient, keeps going because cosmic duty doesn't have a retirement policy. For these beings, decisions don't carry the same weight they carry for Bek because the consequences of those decisions don't have the same finality. Bek's presence in the story is what reintroduces that finality. Every choice he makes is made with full awareness that he has one body, one life, no resurrection clause, and a finite amount of time in which any of this matters. When he chooses to act in the climax, he's not spending a resource that refills. He's spending the only currency he actually has. The gods around him can talk about sacrifice in abstract terms. Bek performs it in the most literal possible way, and the film understands that this is not a smaller thing than divine battle. It's a larger one, precisely because it's irreversible. This is why the movie's argument about power ultimately leads back to mortality. A ruler who can't die, who won't age, who faces no permanent consequences for their decisions, is structurally insulated from accountability in the most profound way. They can experiment with people's lives. They can make bad calls and course correct across centuries. The people under them don't have that luxury. The gap between divine and human experience isn't just physical scale. It's the gap between reversible and irreversible, between consequence, light, and consequence, permanent. Horus only starts becoming worthy of rule when he starts genuinely internalizing that gap. When he starts treating Bek's time and Bek's life as something that can't be returned if squandered. Chaos, order, and the third option. Egyptian mythology has always operated on the axis of Ma'at versus Isfet, order versus chaos, and Gods of Egypt engages that framework while quietly suggesting it's insufficient. Set is the chaos agent, the disruptor who tears down the existing structure. But the film complicates this by showing that the order Horus represents wasn't exactly just either. It was a hierarchy that benefited gods and wealthy humans and left everyone else to manage. Set isn't chaos descending on paradise. He's a malfunction in a system that was already running on exclusion. What Horus is building toward isn't a restoration of the old order. It's a third thing, a revised model of governance that tries to account for the people who are always getting crushed in both versions. The afterlife system change is the clearest expression of this. He doesn't just restore the preset era where the gates were open. He takes positive action to make the system more just than it was before the whole conflict started. That's not chaos, and it's not the original order. It's something harder and more interesting. The film frames this through Ra's relationship with Apophis. The great serpent circles eternally, and Ra fights it off eternally, and neither destroys the other. Existence is maintained not by the permanent victory of order, but by the permanent vigilance against chaos. A maintenance job, not a conquest. It's a mythological argument against any kind of political absolutism, the idea that you can win the chaos order war permanently, establish a perfect system, and stop paying attention. Ra's exhaustion is a warning about what endless, unquestioned authority costs. Horus's arc is about learning to do the work of governance with that warning in mind. The myth about myth. There's one more thematic layer worth naming, because it's the one that gives Gods of Egypt its most unusual quality among fantasy blockbusters of its era. The film is quietly interrogating the purpose of mythology itself, asking why humans tell stories about divine beings and what those stories do for us beyond simple entertainment. The gods in this world don't sustain themselves on worship as some kind of egotistical battery. They sustain themselves on belief in the possibility of justice, in the idea that the universe has something like a moral architecture. When Set corrupts the afterlife system, he's not just politically destabilizing Egypt, he's eroding the thing that makes human endurance possible, the conviction that suffering eventually resolves into something meaningful. Zaya's faith in Horus isn't naive. It's an active philosophical position that the world's divine structure can be held accountable to its own stated values, and that holding it accountable is worth dying for. That's what mythology has always been for, underneath the monsters and the magic. It's a set of stories that say, the world has a shape, and that shape can be argued with, and the argument matters. Gods of Egypt takes that function seriously in a way that a lot of more polished, more critically approved fantasy films don't. It believes in the stakes of its own mythology, which is the prerequisite for making an audience believe in them too. Imperfectly executed? Yes. Occasionally clumsy in how it handles these ideas? Absolutely. But shallow? Not really. Not if you're actually watching. Gods of Egypt arrived in February 2016 carrying the particular kind of anticipation that comes when a studio spends serious money on something genuinely weird. Summit Entertainment and Lionsgate put roughly $140 million on the table for a flat Earth mythology adventure with giant transforming gods and a mortal thief at its center, the kind of swing that, when it works, becomes a beloved franchise, and when it doesn't, becomes a cautionary tale told in film school budgeting lectures. It didn't work. Not commercially, not critically, not in the way anyone had hoped. The reception, a collision of expectation. The critical response, when Gods of Egypt opened, was swift and largely merciless. Reviews focused heavily on the casting controversy. A film set in ancient Egypt populated predominantly by white and Australian actors drew sharp, legitimate criticism before a single frame had screened publicly. Director Alex Proyas and Lionsgate both issued apologies ahead of release, acknowledging the lack of diversity in a production that should have been an obvious opportunity to platform actors of African and Middle Eastern heritage. That conversation was necessary and correct, and it dominated the film's cultural moment in a way that made engaging with anything else about it feel almost beside the point. The box office confirmed the damage. Opening weekend in North America brought in around $14 million against that $140 million production budget, a number that tells you everything about the size of the gap between what the studio anticipated and what audiences delivered. International markets performed somewhat better, but not nearly enough to rescue the film's financial story. By any commercial measure, Gods of Egypt was a significant failure, and it arrived at the beginning of a year packed with franchise entries and prestige pictures that made it feel doubly orphaned. Too weird to fit neatly into either category, too expensive to be forgiven for not landing. What's worth noting is how rarely the critical conversation engaged with what the film was actually trying to do. Most reviews benchmarked it against the idea of a serious mythological epic and found it absurd by that standard. The word campy appeared with striking frequency, used almost entirely as a verdict rather than a description. And there's something telling in that reflex, the assumption that visual excess and tonal earnestness are incompatible with genuine ambition, that a film this colorful and this loud couldn't possibly have anything real to say. The whitewashing conversation and its lasting importance. The casting controversy surrounding Gods of Egypt was part of a broader cultural reckoning happening in Hollywood during the mid-2010s. A period when films like Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Aloha were each drawing similar criticism for similar choices. The cumulative weight of those controversies contributed meaningfully to a shift in how studios approach casting in culturally specific projects, a shift that became more pronounced and more publicly enforced as the decade progressed. In that sense, the controversy around Gods of Egypt was historically useful, even if that's cold comfort for how it landed on the film itself. It became one of a cluster of examples used in concrete industry discussions about who gets to represent which stories on screen, and the pressure those discussions generated is visible in subsequent casting decisions across the studio system. The film's failure, commercial and reputational, made the argument in the most pragmatic language Hollywood understands. This approach cost you money, audience trust, and cultural relevance simultaneously. That legacy is real and significant. It's also separate from the question of whether the film itself had merit, and collapsing the two discussions, treating the casting failures as evidence that the movie had nothing to offer, shortcuts, a more honest accounting. The cult audience and the reappraisal question. Here's something interesting that happened after Gods of Egypt left theaters. People kept watching it. Home video, streaming platforms, late-night cable. The film found a persistent audience that didn't need critical permission to enjoy it. That audience tends to engage with it on its own terms, as a maximalist fantasy spectacle with a genuine heart underneath its excessive surface, and the gap between how that audience experiences the film and how it was received critically has become one of the more telling disconnects in mid-2010s studio cinema. The reappraisal conversation around Gods of Egypt is quieter and less organized than the ones that have formed around films like John Carter or Speed Racer, other big-budget failures that found passionate defenders in the years following their theatrical disappointments. But it exists. Essays and video analyses have gradually accumulated around the film, making arguments about its visual ambition, its thematic coherence, and the specific intelligence in its character dynamic. None of them argue it's a masterpiece. Most of them argue it's far more interesting than its reputation allows, and that the gap between interesting and masterpiece is not the same as the gap between interesting and worthless. What those reappraisals tend to share is an attention to specificity, the willingness to look at what the film actually does, rather than measuring it against the ideal version of itself that was never going to be made on this budget with this director's aesthetic instincts. That kind of attention is exactly what the film's theatrical moment denied it, and watching it find that audience belatedly is a small but genuine vindication of the idea that cultural conversation about films doesn't end when the box office weekend closes. Alex Proyas and the question of authorship. Gods of Egypt sits in a strange place within Alex Proyas's filmography. Coming after the genuinely visionary Dark City, the crowd-pleasing competence of I, Robot, and the genuinely unnerving Knowing, it represents his most expensive and most visually maximalist work, and also the project that most visibly strained the relationship between his specific sensibilities and the demands of a studio blockbuster format. Proyas has always been a filmmaker interested in worlds that follow rules different from ours, dreamlike, hyper-constructed, operating on a visual logic that's more expressionistic than naturalistic. That sensibility thrives when it has a tight enough container. Dark City's compressed noir world, The Crow's gothic stylization. When that sensibility is scaled to 140 million and the demands of a global audience, the results are more complicated. The ambition expands, the control becomes harder to maintain, the places where the craft doesn't quite reach the vision become more visible. What Gods of Egypt reveals about Proyas is that his specific kind of imagination, mythic, architectural, interested in systems and hierarchies as much as in individual psychology, needed either a much larger budget to fully realize what it was attempting, or a much smaller one that forced creative constraints to do the work that CG dollars couldn't quite accomplish. Somewhere between those two extremes, Gods of Egypt lives and mostly works and occasionally falters, the product of a genuinely distinctive directorial voice trying to work at a scale that kept outrunning him. What it leaves behind. A film doesn't have to succeed to matter. Gods of Egypt didn't launch a franchise, didn't reshape the fantasy blockbuster genre, didn't win awards or recoup its budget or add a chapter to the story of Hollywood getting Egyptian mythology right. By every metric the industry uses to measure these things, it failed. But it attempted something that most films in its category don't even try. It built a mythological world with an internal economic system and a genuine political argument, populated it with characters whose emotional arcs were tied to something more substantial than survival and spectacle, and asked those characters to carry a film-length thesis about the nature of power and the limits of divine authority. It did all of that while also giving you a giant armored falcon god fighting a sand monster above a solar ship at the edge of a flat Earth. The two things aren't contradictions. That's maybe the most important thing Gods of Egypt demonstrates. Imperfectly and loudly and with varying degrees of success, spectacle, and sincerity can coexist. Visual excess and thematic substance aren't mutually exclusive. A movie can be genuinely, gloriously over the top and still be arguing about something that matters, about who gets to rule, about what we owe each other, about the specific kind of love that makes a person willing to walk into a trap built for gods. The ancient Egyptians understood something about mythology that modern cinema tends to forget. The stories were never just entertainment. They were instructions for how to live. They encoded values, punished certain behaviors, rewarded others, and gave ordinary people a way to think about their place in a universe that was larger and stranger and more indifferent than they could fully comprehend. Gods of Egypt reaches for that function, clumsily and ambitiously, and with a 140 million CG budget and a cast of gods who bleed gold. It doesn't fully achieve it, but it reaches, and in a landscape full of films that have stopped reaching for anything beyond the next sequel announcement, that reaching means something. The gold bleeds. The mortal keeps going, and somewhere between those two facts is the whole argument. There's a moment early in Gods of Egypt where a thief stands at the edge of a trap. Not a metaphorical trap, not a moral dilemma dressed up in narrative clothing, but a literal mechanical death contraption built by gods who designed it specifically so that no human being could survive it. And he steps forward anyway. No divine protection, no prophecy choosing him. Just a young man who decided that loving someone was sufficient reason to do something catastrophically stupid, and that the universe would simply have to accommodate that decision. That moment is the movie's whole argument in physical form. Everything else, the gold-bleeding gods, the armored transformations, the flat earth spinning at the edge of infinite darkness, is context for that single human choice. And the fact that the film surrounds that choice with the most maximalist fantasy visual language Hollywood could generate in 2016 isn't a contradiction. It's the point. Small, irreversible human decisions look different when you can see the cosmic machinery they're being made inside of. Gods of Egypt was released in February 2016, directed by Alex Proyas, the Australian filmmaker responsible for The Crow, Dark City, and Knowing. And it arrived carrying a specific kind of studio ambition, the kind that bets $140 million on a completely original mythology, builds it from scratch on Australian sound stages and digital compositing suites, and then asks a global audience to accept a world where the gods are 9 feet tall, the afterlife has an entrance fee, and the sun is a ship piloted by a tired old man fighting a serpent every single night just to make sure the morning keeps happening. The film was not received warmly. Critics found it excessive. Its casting choices drew significant and legitimate controversy, and the box office numbers told a story that studio accounting departments remember with a wince. But critical reception and cultural value are not the same conversation, and Gods of Egypt, rewatched now, engaged on its own terms, turns out to be doing something more coherent and more interesting than its reputation has ever allowed it credit for. This essay is that conversation. A world that was never meant to be realistic, the Egypt of Gods of Egypt announces itself in the opening frames as a place that follows mythological logic rather than physical logic. The establishing shots don't ease you in with wide desert landscapes or archaeological realism. They drop you directly into a city that looks like someone handed an ancient Egyptian architect the budget of a small nation, eliminated all structural limitations, and said, build something that communicates divine hierarchy in every surface and angle. The result is a place of overwhelming vertical scale. Towers that shouldn't be able to stand physically do stand, because the gods who built them weren't constrained by engineering. Waterways cut through city centers at angles that defy gravity. Markets are piled with goods in quantities that suggest a civilization running at a kind of supernatural abundance, which makes sense, because this Egypt isn't a historically grounded society managing scarce resources. It's a divine administrative zone, and the gods administering it have access to powers that make scarcity mostly irrelevant for the upper tier of the hierarchy. For the lower tier, the humans, things look different. The markets are full, yes, but the people moving through them carry the specific body language of people who are aware, at all times, that they're operating at the sufferance of beings who could rearrange their lives with a gesture. There's no rebellion in the streets, no obvious discontent, but there's a quality of cautious transactionalism in how the human characters move through divine spaces. They're not citizens, they're residents under management. This distinction matters enormously for what the film is going to spend its runtime arguing. The world it builds isn't a utopia disrupted by a villain. It's a hierarchy with problems baked into its architecture before Set ever walks through the door. The gods live at the top, literally, on platforms and in palaces that sit above the city like permanent reminders of the gap between divine and human existence. The humans live below, surrounded by evidence of divine power, producing the wealth and the worship that the whole system runs on. It's a feudal structure wearing mythological clothing, and the film is self-aware enough to make that structure visible rather than romanticizing it. The coronation, a ceremony that's already broken. The coronation of Horus is staged as a celebration, but watch it again and you'll see that every visual choice undermines the warmth. The crowd is enormous, the ceremony is spectacular, but the people cheering are performing enthusiasm more than feeling it, and the distance between the gods on the elevated platform and the humans watching from below communicates, geometrically, the nature of the relationship being celebrated. This is not a community gathering to honor a leader they chose. This is a population attending a transfer of ownership. Horus himself is genuinely charismatic in these early scenes, which is important because his charisma is the first thing the film wants you to slightly distrust. He moves through the ceremony with the ease of someone who has never seriously entertained doubt, trading smiles with Hathor, absorbing the crowd's adoration with a kind of relaxed pleasure that reveals exactly how thoroughly he has conflated being liked with being worthy of ruling. He's not performing for the crowd. He's genuinely enjoying himself. And that enjoyment, that absolute comfort with being at the center of the world's attention, is a character portrait delivered entirely through physical presence before a single word of dialogue establishes it directly. Osiris watches his son with something more complicated than parental pride. There's a wariness in how Geoffrey Rush plays that brief role, a god who's been around long enough to know that confidence and competence are different currencies, and that the gap between them tends to announce itself at the worst possible moment. His coronation speech, with its emphasis on service and responsibility, lands differently when you've already clocked how Horus is receiving it, with the polite attention of someone who already knows everything being said and doesn't need to let it actually change him. Set's arrival collapses all of that in seconds. Not slowly, not dramatically telegraphed from across the room. He simply arrives, announces his intentions with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided the outcome, and converts a ceremony of succession into an execution site before the assembled crowd has time to process the transition. The speed of it is deliberate. This is a coup staged by someone who understands that the most effective violence is violence that happens before its targets have time to form a collective response. Set doesn't need a speech. He needs a moment of frozen disbelief, and the coronation's own atmosphere of grandeur and celebration provides it perfectly. The blinding of Horus is the moment the film's central metaphor is planted. It's staged with enough physical horror to make it genuinely uncomfortable. This is not a clean, consequence-free mythological battle. It's an intimate brutality, one god taking something irreplaceable from another, in a way that's designed to be both a practical advantage and a symbolic statement. A sky god without eyes is a ruler who cannot see his people. A king, blinded at his own coronation, cannot witness the consequences of his own court's failure. The metaphor isn't subtle, but its lack of subtlety is matched by the physical reality of the act, which grounds the abstract meaning in something you feel rather than just understand. Bek and Zaya, the human lens. The film's smartest structural decision is introducing Bek and Zaya before the coronation settles into full swing, because it means you experience the divine power transfer through people who feel its weight rather than people who wield it. By the time Set announces his new laws, you've already been given a pair of eyes, specifically Bek's skeptical, exhausted, love-sharpened eyes, through which all of this divine drama is filtered into human consequence. Bek is not an aspirational hero. He's not dreaming of adventure or looking for a way to prove himself. He's trying to keep himself and the person he loves alive and adjacent to okay in a world designed to make that difficult. He steals because it's the most effective tool available to someone with no divine backing and no political connections. And he's good at it, the way people get good at things they've had to rely on to survive. There's no particular pride in the skill for him. It's just the verb that keeps him and Zaya fed and housed in a world that isn't especially interested in their welfare. Zaya is more complicated, and the film uses that complication to define the emotional stakes with precision. She believes in Horus. Not as a fan, not as someone naively impressed by divine spectacle, but as someone who has thought carefully about the system she lives inside and concluded that the right divine leadership makes a genuine, material difference to people like her. That's a considered political position, not a fairy tale. She knows the gods don't always look at mortals. She's asking for a god who at least tries to look in the right direction. Bek thinks she's wrong. Not about whether the gods affect human lives, but about whether any particular god's goodness can be relied upon to improve them. His worldview is empirical and slightly bitter. Look at what the divine hierarchy has actually produced for people without power, and then tell me which god's coronation is going to change that equation. He loves Zaya so much that he doesn't argue the point. He just keeps working within the system as it actually operates, hoarding small advantages, minimizing exposure to divine indifference, trying to build a life in the cracks between the enormous and the irreducible. Their relationship, established in these early scenes, is doing more heavy lifting than the screenplay explicitly acknowledges, because what Bek and Zaya represent is the film's actual thesis in miniature, the question of whether a person should orient their hope toward the systems that govern them or toward the specific, irreplaceable individuals they love. Zaya bets on the system, on the idea that fixing who's in charge will change what the world does to people like her. Bek bets on the person, on Zaya herself, on the specific weight of her existence in his life, on the calculation that one person's safety and happiness is worth more investment than any political theory. Both of them are right, in the ways that matter. The film knows this. It never asks you to choose between their worldviews. What it does instead is make sure you understand both well enough that when the cost of each arrives, when Zaya's faith and Bek's pragmatism collide with the reality of Set's coup, you feel the loss in both registers simultaneously. What kind of story is this? Before the first act closes, Gods of Egypt has established itself as something more layered than its marketing suggested. The trailer sold a spectacle film, Gods fighting at epic scale, visual effect sequences stacked on top of each other, the promise of mythological warfare rendered in digital gold and fire. And the film does deliver those things, but it delivers them inside a frame that's specifically interested in the relationship between power and accountability, between divine authority and human experience, between the systems we build and the people those systems fail. It's a buddy film at heart. The disgraced god and the grieving thief, two people who need each other for completely different reasons and gradually discover that the difference in their reasons is exactly what makes their alliance transformative rather than merely transactional. It's a political film wearing mythological costume, asking the same questions about legitimacy and governance that any good political story asks, just with more gold and larger combatants. It's a love story in which love is never simplified into a reward structure or a guaranteed happy ending, but is instead presented as the specific, irrational, irreplaceable thing that makes the rest of the story's arguments matter. And it's a film that is genuinely, earnestly, unself-consciously committed to the world it's built, which is rarer than it sounds. Many fantasy blockbusters of its era hedge their sincerity with ironic distance, as if embarrassed by their own investment in the mythology they're depicting. Gods of Egypt doesn't hedge. It believes in Egypt the way myth itself believes, completely, specifically, and with full awareness that the belief is the point. Whether you can meet that belief halfway is the question the film puts to you in its first 10 minutes. If you can accept the gold and the scale and the flat earth and the gods who bleed light, what you find on the other side of that acceptance is a story that has thought carefully about why it's telling you the things it's telling you. And that's a more interesting thing to discover about a movie than most people who dismissed it ever gave themselves the chance to find out. The first act of Gods of Egypt moves quickly, but it's packing an unusual amount of ideological content into what looks on the surface like straightforward action storytelling. Within its first 30 minutes, the film establishes a working economy, a political structure, a theological system, a romantic relationship, a power dynamic between two rival gods, and the specific grievance that's going to drive the next 2 hours. That's an enormous amount of world building to accomplish without grinding the pace to a halt, and the fact that the film largely pulls it off is a testament to how efficiently its screenplay, credited to Matt Sazama and Burke Sharpless, translates complex mythology into legible human drama. The key is that everything is established through character motivation rather than exposition. We don't learn about the afterlife toll through a narrator or a text card. We learn about it through Bek calculating what Zaya would need to take with her. We don't learn about Set's resentment through a flashback. We learn about it through the particular quality of triumph on Butler's face when he takes the throne. Something too hungry to be simple satisfaction, something that's been waiting too long to feel like clean victory. The world's rules are delivered through the desires and fears of the people operating inside them. Set's coup, the architecture of grievance. Set's takeover is the film's first set piece, and it's staged with a directness that refuses the usual slow-burn villainy. He doesn't manipulate from the shadows or position allies over months of scheming. He walks into the coronation in front of everyone and takes what he wants by force, and the brazenness of the act is the act's entire message. I am not asking for permission. I am not operating within your rules. Your rules are the problem. There's genuine anger underneath the coup's execution, and Butler lets it show in specific ways. When he kills Osiris, it's not performed as a cold tactical maneuver. It's performed as the release of pressure that has been building for a very long time, a son finally screaming back at a family that organized itself around his exclusion. That reading makes Set's violence harder to dismiss as simple evil. It doesn't excuse it, it explains it. And explanation here is more dramatically useful than any amount of pure menace would be. The new laws Set announces immediately after taking power are where the film's political argument sharpens into focus. The afterlife toll is the most significant, but equally telling is how he handles the other gods. Those who pledge loyalty are allowed to keep some version of their former existence. Those who don't are stripped of power or imprisoned. It's the classic logic of authoritarian consolidation. Move fast, reward compliance, punish resistance, and frame the whole thing as a new order rather than a crime. The terminology of legitimacy is immediately repurposed to serve illegitimate ends. Set doesn't describe what he's done as a coup. He describes it as a correction. Watching Egyptian citizens process these announcements is one of the film's most quietly effective choices. There's no dramatic uprising, no collective resistance, no hero standing up in the crowd to shout defiance. People absorb the new reality the way people almost always absorb sudden political ruptures, with stunned compliance that hardens gradually into accommodation. The film is honest about this, even if it's not especially comfortable. Most people, most of the time, adapt to the systems they find themselves inside rather than fighting them. That's not cowardice. That's the arithmetic of survival. Bek's decision to steal Horus's eye is remarkable specifically because it is so statistically unusual. Zaya's faith and its cost. Zaya's assignment to Urshi's architectural project, forced labor in service of Set's monument-building ambitions, is the film's most specific portrait of how authoritarian regimes convert human lives into resources. She is there because she's skilled, and because the new administration has no mechanism for distinguishing between willing contributor and conscripted specialist. Under Set's governance, the question of consent is beside the point. You are useful, or you are not. If you are useful, you are used. What the film captures well in these scenes is the specific kind of degradation involved in being forced to contribute to something you find morally wrong. Zaya isn't being tortured. She's building things that will be used against everything she believes in, and she has to do it competently and continuously because the alternative is worse. The compliance isn't performed with enthusiasm, but it has to be performed, and that performance, that daily enactment of going along, accumulates into its own kind of weight. Her faith in Horus persists through this, and understanding why is important. It's not blind devotion to divine authority. It's a specific ideological commitment, the belief that the difference between good governance and bad governance is real and measurable, and that working toward a world governed by the former is worth personal cost. She doesn't expect Horus to rescue her personally. She expects the restoration of a system in which people like her are seen as something more than production units. That's a political aspiration, not a romantic fantasy, and the film treats it with the seriousness it deserves. When her arc ends in the first act, abruptly, before she's been given the screen time to fully realize her potential as a character, the loss registers on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the personal loss Bek experiences, which the film foregrounds. There's also the loss of her specific voice and her specific argument about faith and governance, which the rest of the film has to carry without her direct articulation of it. That's a structural decision that costs the movie something real, even as it drives the plot forward with necessary urgency. Bek's heist. Love as action. The vault sequence where Bek steals Horus's eye is the first act's action showcase, but its real function is characterological. Watching Bek navigate traps designed for divine intruders, using only agility, observation, and a refusal to respect the physical limitations that the trap designers assumed would apply, is the film's clearest early statement about what human ingenuity looks like when it's properly motivated. The traps themselves are worth dwelling on. They're elaborate, clearly expensive in their construction, and built on the assumption that anyone trying to get through them would either have divine power or not be standing up anymore after the first corridor. Bek has neither of those things. What he has is patience, attention to patterns, and the particular problem-solving mode that activates when someone has nothing to lose. He watches. He calculates. He moves at moments that the trap's rhythms leave open, and the film choreographs his passage through the vault as a kind of improvisational conversation between a mortal's intuition and architecture designed to prevent it. There's also an element of genuine recklessness in how he moves. Bek isn't a master thief executing a flawless plan. He's a man in love making it up as he goes, succeeding through a combination of skill and the specific recklessness that grief produces in people who stop calculating risk the way they used to. He gets through the vault not despite his emotional state, but partly because of it. Because someone who's already absorbed the worst the world can do to them has a different relationship to danger than someone who still has everything to lose. The retrieval of the eye is a victory with an immediate, attached defeat, and the film stages the transition between them without softening. The eye is in Bek's hands. Then the cost arrives. The architecture of the first act snaps shut around that sequence like the trap Bek just escaped from, and he walks out of it with what he went in for and without, the only reason he went in at all. By the time Horus enters the story as Bek's necessary partner, the first meeting between them striking exactly the register of two people who need each other in ways neither of them is happy about. Act 1 has done its work. The stakes are personal. The argument is structural. The partnership is about to become the film's real subject. Road stories live or die in the friction between their travelers, and the Road Gods of Egypt builds across its second act is specifically designed to maximize productive friction between Horus and Bek. They're not just different in terms of species and power level. They're different in terms of what they believe the world owes them, what they're afraid of, and what they consider worth fighting for. Putting those differences in motion across a series of escalating obstacles doesn't just advance the plot. It performs the film's central argument that a god can only learn to rule well from below, and that a mortal can only push a god toward that learning by refusing to be impressed by divinity. The mechanics of unlikely alliance. The early dynamic between Horus and Bek is established through a very specific kind of standoff. Horus has power, Even diminished, even partially blind, he's still a god, still capable of things that would be physically impossible for Bek. Bek has leverage, specifically the eye he stole, which he controls and Horus needs. Neither of them can simply dominate the other, and that forced equality is the relationship's foundational condition. Watch how Horus manages this. He defaults immediately to the vocabulary of transaction, offering Bek the return of Zaya in exchange for cooperation, framing the whole arrangement as a deal between unequals who have briefly found themselves in equivalent bargaining positions. It's the language of someone who has never had to ask for anything, who has always been in the position of granting rather than needing, and finds the reversal deeply uncomfortable in ways his pride won't let him directly acknowledge. The offer is genuine. The tone in which it's delivered reveals how strange it feels to him to be making it. Bek takes the deal because he has no better option, but he takes it on his own terms, with a flatness that declines to perform gratitude or reverence, with a directness that treats Horus's divine status as a fact rather than a distinction. He's not dismissive of what Horus is, he just refuses to let it organize his behavior. This refusal is precisely what makes him useful to Horus beyond the mechanics of the transaction, though neither of them can see that yet. The desert and what it tests. The journey through the desert is the film's longest sustained test of the Horus-Bek alliance, and it works because the desert does what deserts do in mythology: it strips things down. The elaborate divine architecture falls away. The social structures that told each of them where they stood relative to the other become irrelevant. What remains is two figures moving through heat and exposure with a shared objective and incompatible assumptions about how to pursue it. Horus's physical condition in this section does interesting work. He's not helpless, but he's compromised in ways that force him to be present with his vulnerability, rather than managing it behind divine competence. There are moments where he needs to stop. Moments where the distance between who he was before the coronation and who he is now registers physically, visibly, in ways he can't conceal behind bravado. He manages these moments with a combination of defensiveness and dark humor that is Coster Waldau's sharpest work in the film, a god learning to make peace with limitation without calling it peace. Bek, meanwhile, is discovering something unexpected, that the gap between divine and human capability, while real, is not the same as the gap between divine and human intelligence. He keeps noticing things Horus misses. He keeps solving problems that Horus's approach, shaped entirely by centuries of having enough power to bulldoze through obstacles rather than navigate them, would have made worse. Their dynamic shifts gradually and almost imperceptibly from God, reluctantly accepting human assistance, to two problem solvers with different tools respecting what the other brings. That shift is never announced. It's just visible if you're watching. Thoth's library, knowledge, and the price of certainty. The sequence involving Thoth is tonally the film's most unusual passage, and is one of the most revealing about what gods of Egypt is actually interested in. Thoth is introduced as the god of wisdom, but Chadwick Boseman plays him as something more specifically recognizable, an intellectual who has accumulated so much knowledge that certainty has become his default mode, and who is therefore somewhat less wise than his title implies, because wisdom requires humility and certainty resists it. His library, an impossible space where multiple copies of Thoth move between shelves of accumulated thought, is staged as both impressive and slightly comic. All that knowledge, and the god who holds it, spends considerable energy being impressed by himself. The humor is sharp precisely because it's not mean-spirited. Thoth isn't being mocked. He's being gently shown that competence and self-awareness are not the same commodity, which is the same lesson Horus is learning on a different frequency. What the Thoth sequence gives the plot is crucial information about Set's endgame, but what it gives the film is a perspective on the whole enterprise that neither Horus nor Bek can provide: the long view. Thoth knows enough history to recognize patterns. He sees what Set is moving toward before Horus or Bek can frame it, and he chooses to engage rather than observe from safety. That choice, a god of pure intellect deciding that this specific situation requires action rather than observation, quietly models exactly what the film is asking of Horus on a larger scale. Hathor's compromise and what it revealed. When Hathor joins the journey, she brings with her the thing that the Horus-Bek dynamic has been missing: evidence that survival inside Set's regime requires a different kind of courage than the kind either of them has been practicing. Bek's courage is operational: keep moving, keep solving, stay alive. Horus's courage is confrontational: meet force with force, hold ground, maintain the self-image of someone who doesn't retreat. Hathor's courage is the hardest kind: the endurance of performing compliance while carrying resistance inside, for years, without the visible heroism of open defiance. Her bracelet, the one containing souls of the dead, the one that would kill her if removed, is a perfect encapsulation of her situation. She is literally wearing the price of her survival arrangement. She can't take it off without destroying herself, and she can't wear it forever without being complicit in what it represents. That's not a magical detail. That's a portrait of moral compromise, under authoritarian constraint, rendered in mythological terms with genuine precision. Her dynamic with Horus reactivates history that the film doesn't fully explain, and the restraint there is wise. Their scenes together are charged with the specific electricity of people who know too much about each other, who have seen versions of each other that the current moment's roles don't accommodate. She sees through his bravado with the ease of someone who was there when it developed. He treats her with a care that's different from how he treats everyone else, more considered and slightly more honest, as if her presence activates a version of himself that the God of the Sky performance has been slowly burying. Ra and the Edge of the World. The visit to Ra's domain is the film's most cosmologically ambitious sequence, and it pays off the flat Earth world building in a way that earns the concept's weirdness. The solar ship isn't just a cool image, it's a theological statement. The universe requires active maintenance, and the being doing that maintenance is tired. Ra's characterization by Jeffrey Rush in this sequence is the film's most unusual performance. An ancient god who has outlived enthusiasm and settled into something that looks like duty but feels like obligation. He keeps the darkness at bay because stopping would mean Apophis wins, not because he's found a way to make cosmic stewardship meaningful. He's the universe's night shift worker, endlessly vigilant, profoundly alone, doing the thing that has to be done because no one else is there to do it. For Horus, the encounter is recalibrating. He came to Ra looking for restoration, the divine parent figure coming through at the crucial moment. What he gets instead is a demonstration that even the oldest, most powerful gods in the hierarchy are constrained by the obligations of their position. That authority comes with duties that can't be delegated or ignored. Ra can't leave his ship to fix Egypt's political crisis. He can offer perspective and limited assistance, but the actual work of changing the world Horus lives in belongs to the people living in it. That's a sobering message for a god who arrived hoping for rescue. It's also the message the film has been building toward since the first act. The people at the top of the cosmic hierarchy are not going to swoop down and solve the problems the people beneath them are living inside. Change requires proximity to consequence, and consequence, in Gods of Egypt, only truly touches the people close enough to the ground to feel it. Third acts in mythology-based blockbusters carry a specific burden. They have to resolve the plot's mechanical tensions, while simultaneously delivering on the emotional and thematic promises the story has been building toward. Miss either target and the whole structure loses integrity. Hit both, and you've made something that holds up beyond the spectacle. Gods of Egypt's final act is, arguably, the segment where the film comes closest to fully justifying its own ambitions. Not because everything works, but because the things that do work matter in exactly the ways the film needs them to. The pyramid's true purpose, Set's pyramid, has been present throughout the second act as a looming architectural fact. The thing Zaya was forced to help build, the thing that Bek and Horus are racing against without fully understanding it. When its true function is revealed, the film earns its earlier investment in the afterlife toll system in a way that retroactively sharpens everything. The pyramid isn't a monument to Set's ego, though it is that too in the way that all authoritarian architecture is ego-made structural. It's a mechanism, a soul-powered weapon designed to breach the barrier between the known world and the void, the accumulated treasure of the dead. The toll Set has been extracting from every soul passing through Anubis's gate is the fuel. Months or years of systematic extraction from the most vulnerable population imaginable, people who are already dead, already without recourse, already dependent on the mercy of the divine system they're passing through, has been redirected into a cosmic weapon. The horror of this is quiet but specific. Set hasn't just been governing unjustly, he's been consuming the savings of the deceased to fund his own annihilation with. This revelation transforms Set's character arc from resentful power grabber into something more genuinely tragic. He's not trying to rule forever, he's trying to end everything. The long game he's been running isn't about dynasty or legacy, it's about making the cosmic reality match his internal experience. If he couldn't have a world that acknowledged him, then acknowledgement and existence could go together. It's the logic of annihilation, not malicious exactly, but completely self-consumed, unable to imagine that the universe could be worth maintaining if his particular wound within it couldn't be healed. Gerard Butler plays this revelation with a kind of weary determination that is the performance's most affecting note. This is a god who has stopped wanting things. He wants one thing, this, and after that, he seems genuinely indifferent to outcomes. That blankness underneath the power is more frightening than any amount of triumphant villain energy would be. It suggests a being who has moved through resentment and rage and come out the other side into a place where nothing matters enough to protect. Bek's ticking clock, running parallel to the cosmic stakes, is Bek's personal timeline, and the film handles the tension between these two registers with more grace than it's usually credited with. The deal Bek made with Horus, Zaya's resurrection in exchange for his assistance, has a specific weight that every scene in the third act is subtly pressing against. Every moment spent chasing Set is a moment not spent honoring that bargain, and Bek is aware of this with an intensity that the film keeps visible in how Thwaites plays every scene. There's a version of this character who becomes impatient and resentful as the third act escalates, who starts making demands or threatening to walk away in ways that would derail the cosmic mission for personal reasons. Bek never becomes that character, not because he doesn't feel the pull. You can see that he does, but because he's intelligent enough to know that Horus restoring the world is the prerequisite for Horus restoring Zaya, and emotionally sophisticated enough to hold both commitments simultaneously without letting either collapse the other. That's a specific kind of emotional maturity that the film doesn't announce. It just demonstrates it continuously in how Bek moves through the third act's events. He stays, he helps, he carries his grief alongside his mission the way people actually carry grief. Not by setting it aside cleanly, but by learning to function with its weight built into every step. The final confrontation, two philosophies in physical form, the battle between Horus and Set, reaches its peak in a sequence that the film has been planning since the coronation, and it delivers on that planning in a way that works on both the spectacular and the symbolic level. Their divine forms, Horus's great falcon warrior against Set's armored embodiment of war itself, make the philosophical clash between them visible in exactly the way the film's mythological logic demands. This isn't just two gods fighting, it's two ideas about power making contact and testing which one survives. Set's fighting style is overwhelming force, relentless forward pressure, the application of maximum violence at every moment. It's power that doesn't negotiate, doesn't read its environment, doesn't adjust to changing conditions. It knows one mode. That mode is devastation. In the early going, it works. Horus is pushed back repeatedly, because Horus has been learning something over the course of the film that Set never bothered to learn: when to stop pressing and when to redirect. The turning point in the fight isn't a moment of superior firepower. It's a moment of superior awareness. Horus reading Set's patterns, the way Bek read the vault's patterns, and finding the gap between assaults where something different is possible. That parallel is deliberate. Horus has absorbed something from Bek, not as explicit teaching, but through the experience of watching a human navigate impossible situations through attention and adaptation, rather than overwhelming strength. The student-teacher dynamic that the film established between Bek and Horus across Act 2 pays off in the fight that should, by every conventional logic, not involve anything Bek taught. Bek's choice and the measure of a human life. The moment where Bek acts without guarantee, inside the climax, is the film's most quietly audacious beat. It's positioned as a minor action in the middle of an enormous battle, almost easy to miss against the scale of what's happening around it. That positioning is precise. The film knows exactly what it's doing by placing a mortal's irreversible personal choice inside a divine conflict that's happening at cosmic scale. What Bek does in that moment costs him the thing he can't replace. It isn't presented heroically in the conventional sense. No swell of music, no slow-motion revelation of his decision, no lingering close-up on his face that tells you this is the meaningful moment. It's delivered at the pace of the action around it, because the film respects the fact that real sacrifice doesn't announce itself with theatrical ceremony. It just happens, while the world keeps moving and the people who understand what it cost are left to carry that understanding alone. The choice lands because of everything the film has been building around. Bek's value in this story was never his combat ability, or his divine connection, or his role in an ancient prophecy. His value was his clarity about what matters, and his willingness to act on that clarity without waiting for the universe to make it easy. He's been that person since the first heist, since the moment he stepped into a trap designed for gods and went forward anyway. The climactic choice isn't a transformation, it's a completion. Ra's intervention and the limits of parental power. Ra's role in the resolution is handled with an economy of expression that suits his characterization throughout. He doesn't arrive as a deus ex machina, doesn't solve the problem that the mortals and the partially restored divine have spent the film working toward. What he does is participate in the resolution in a way that acknowledges his responsibility without overriding everyone else's agency. His relationship with Set is the film's most emotionally complex parent-child dynamic, and the scene where it surfaces in the climax doesn't have time to fully explore it, but it doesn't need to. The outline is clear enough. A father who chose an heir on the basis of cosmic duty rather than equal love and is now living inside the consequences of what that choice produced. Ra isn't absolved by his late intervention, he's just doing, as late as possible, the thing a parent should have done long before the weapons started firing. What he restores to Horus isn't just power. It's recognition, the specific acknowledgement that what Horus has become during the quest is genuinely different from what he was at the coronation. That recognition matters more than the power restoration, because the whole arc has been about proving that the change in Horus is real and durable rather than situational. Ra's recognition is the film's confirmation that the arc is complete. The Afterlife Gate, revised. The dismantling of Set's toll system in the film's resolution is staged without fanfare, and the lack of fanfare is appropriate. There's no ceremony, no announcement to assembled crowds, just a structural change in how the gate operates, removing the economic barrier that Set placed between the dead and their peace. People who had been waiting, souls with nothing left to offer, turned away from the only destination that mattered, are admitted. That image, simple and unhurried, is the film's most explicitly moral moment. Everything that came before it was about gods and mortals fighting for various forms of power and love and survival. This moment is about governance, about what the divine authority now restored to Horus is actually going to do for the people it's responsible for. The answer is, start here, with the most vulnerable, the ones who couldn't fight and couldn't bargain and could only wait. Start at the gate where the dead stand in line with empty hands and tell them the line is gone. It's not a triumphant image in the blockbuster sense. It doesn't have the visual grandeur of a final battle won or a kingdom restored, but it's the image that makes the whole film's argument coherent, because it shows rather than tells what a ruler who's actually learned something does when they get the power back. Not a parade, not a monument. A gate, open, admitting people who were told they couldn't enter, in a world that has finally decided to mean what its mythology promised.